Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll continue to admit attendees, but let's get the program started. I'm Dorothy Skye. As president of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2021 issues briefing. This year's theme is Empowering the Wisconsin Vote. We've created a packed and varied program, every element of which relates to that theme and ties in with themes being featured by the League of Women Voters of the United States. Next slide, please. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement authored by Grenée Relowitz and Jean Roberts, members of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin Community Action Committee, or Community Alliance Committee, excuse me. Here it is. We are meeting via Zoom, yet each of us is standing or sitting on the ancestral lands of one of the 12 sovereign native nations of Wisconsin. While some of these peoples have been here forever, others are current stewards of homelands of previous nations, such as the Dakota, Fox, and Sac. Whether they were forced out of their original homes like the Oneida, or as the Ho-Chunk, whose oral tradition states, we've always been here and have had their land stolen from them, each of these nations continues to struggle with the effects of colonialism, while at the same time striving to retain their treaty rights and their culture. We honor the land and the peoples of each of these indigenous sovereign nations, past, present, and future. Today at Issues Briefing, we'll hear about voter rights and voter suppression. In this regard, we should note that many indigenous lands, in those lands, people have to travel up to 90 miles to reach a registration site or a polling location. And many of these same rural people don't have reliable broadband to register online. Furthermore, requiring valid residential addresses can also be a problem to people who live on reservations because many of them have only fire numbers. If they make it to the polling place, there can still be problems. This is because although the Wisconsin Election Commission lists tribal IDs as an acceptable form of government-issued identification for voting, some poll workers don't recognize such IDs as valid due to confusion or ignorance. We challenge each of you to learn more about the indigenous peoples in your area, about the struggles they have dealt with regarding voter suppression, and about how they are working to overcome this. We ask that local leagues work to be allies and advocates for fair voter rights and laws on tribal lands. And folks, just a reminder, as you come in, please put yourself on mute to cut down on the background noise. Other little tidbit, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you see the word view with the little 9 dots next to it. We suggest that you choose the speaker view. The speaker view. All righty, next slide. Here's this morning's agenda. Our first keynote speaker, Sara Eskrich, will challenge us to consider a pivotal innovation in our voting process. This will be followed by 2 successive groups of breakout sessions. During the pause between breakouts, you'll have the option of watching a few minutes of personal messages from Wisconsinites who want to help us get out the vote. You have already pre-registered for one of the breakout sessions in the first round. Before the second round of breakouts begins, you'll be given time to pick one of the offerings in that group. After the breakouts, our final keynote speaker, Dr. Deborah Turner, President of the League of Women Voters of the United States, will send us off, energized by her call to action regarding the protection and expansion of voting rights. As a prelude to this League of Women Voters event, we started off with a land acknowledgement. It is also fitting that we acknowledge 2 current outstanding members of our volunteer organization. Next slide, please. Deborah Cron, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters, has the honor of doing that. Debra, you're on.
Thank you, Dorothy, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's my great pleasure to recognize two members of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, Louise Petering, past president of the State League, and Carol Diggleman, emeritus professor at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, both current members of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. Louise and Carol were the driving force behind our efforts over the past year to educate our members on the state of Wisconsin's infrastructure. In collaboration with the American Society of Civil Engineers, Milwaukee section, Carol and Louise planned and launched 4 kickoff meetings, 1 in each quadrant of the state, 7 chapter meetings, each providing expert testimony on different aspects of Wisconsin's failing infrastructure, including energy, roads and bridges, aviation and transit, inland waterways and ports, stormwater and dams, drinking water and wastewater systems, and hazardous and solid waste management systems. Each of these presentations included a report from the American Society of Engineers Infrastructure's report card author and additional experts to address our questions and concern regarding Wisconsin's infrastructure. The program series concluded with a very timely presentation on the economics of infrastructure and the importance of spending for upgrades and maintenance to avoid costly Band-Aid fixes that do not result in adding valuable capital assets to the communities around Wisconsin. Carol and Louise coordinated each of these presentations, identified speakers and moderators, in addition to keeping our partners at the American Society of Civil Engineers, our League's Infrastructure Committee, and the Board of Directors informed every step of the way. This infrastructure program was timely and informative for our members, our elected officials, and everyone who works to provide Wisconsin the infrastructure we need to live our lives. We can all now advocate for the investment we need in our infrastructure. To see any of these presentations, please go to our website, lwvwi.org, and click on Study of Wisconsin's Infrastructure. I sincerely thank Carol and Louise for their dedicated volunteerism. Dorothy, I'll turn it back to you.
Dorothy, you're muted.
I knew I'd do that at least once. The theme of this year's issues briefing is empowering the Wisconsin vote. Our first keynote speaker will advocate an election system innovation that speaks directly to that theme. Sara Eskrich is the executive director of Democracy Found, a Wisconsin-based nonpartisan coalition of leaders committed to revitalizing democracy and empowering voters by implementing a Final Five voting system. Sara will explain how that system works and why it better ensures that politicians are held accountable for delivering results. Sara Eskrich's career includes roles in the public and private sectors. She's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and holds a Master's of Public Affairs from Robert M. Follette School and Master's of Public Health from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Audience members, while Sara is speaking, please put your questions in the chat as they come to mind. Sara will address your questions during the Q&A that follows her formal remarks. And in fact, remember, the chat will be the place to put your questions and comments throughout the issues briefing. And audience members, I realize in addition to learning the particulars of the issues we're discussing, we're all learning how to better utilize Zoom. For those of you who haven't found or used the chat before, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the word more, above which there are 3 dots. And if you click on that, one of your choices will be chat. Good idea to have the chat up and visible throughout this presentation. Okay, Sara, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here this evening and kicking off such a fabulous event you're going to have all day today. I will start by saying I have spoken to many of you. There are many familiar names on this participant list because leagues have hosted me to talk about Final Five all across Wisconsin already. So for those of you who have heard a similar presentation, I'll apologize a bit for repetition today, but I also find that repetition helps enhance our understanding. So I promise to go through the background fairly quickly and leave a lot of time for Q&A so that we can dive deep into discussion. So very briefly to kick off, you all heard a bit about my background, but frankly, I come to this work not as an elections expert, as a democracy expert. I come to this work as a person who cares deeply about policy and who's also been involved in politics for a long time. So what's unique about the work that I'm going to talk about today is that, for me, brought together these two worlds of both frustration with politics in feeling like it was always getting in the way of getting the policy work that I cared so deeply about done. So looking at our system from a systemic level really highlights, again, for me, the frustrations that I saw in those political and policy-oriented worlds. So let me start with just a high-level Venn diagram that frankly sums up the problem that we're going to talk about today. The problem that we see today in this Venn diagram is that it's not a Venn diagram. There is virtually no intersection right now between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood of those members of Congress getting reelected. So in other words, if our elected representatives do their jobs in the way that most of us generally want them and need them to do, they're likely to lose those jobs. And that's a crazy design. So fortunately, understanding that systemic level design shows us there's a way to fix this non-intersecting Venn diagram. So rather than going into the details of that work today, let me just recommend to you all this particular book. So Catherine Gale, who's one of the co-chairs of our effort at Democracy Found, wrote a fabulous book about politics industry theory, where for the first time, she really took competition analysis from the business world and applied it to politics. Suffice to say, the key thing to understand about this book and about the analysis that underpins our work is that competition is key to all healthy industries. Competition drives accountability and competition drives results. You're incentivized in industry to serve your customers because if customers don't get what they want, there's competition and then they go elsewhere and they get what we want and we respond to try to keep those customers. So there's something that seems to be going wrong in politics, right? Because we all know that we're dissatisfied in politics. Congress's approval rating never really goes higher than 20%. And yet nearly 90% of our races for Congress are deemed non-competitive. Furthermore, in the 2020 election, which was one of the highest turnout elections in recent history, effectively 10% of the population elected 86% of our members of Congress. So there's something going wrong at the systemic level. Before I go any further, I should make very clear that today I'm not speaking on behalf of the blue team or the red team, and our work actually doesn't blame individual politicians on either side of the duopoly for this system, because the root cause of our political dysfunction, this problem that endures across all election cycles and all administrations, is the system itself. It's those perverted rules of the game. And the rules of the game in politics, frankly, make prisoners out of even our senators and representatives themselves, because their only option is lockstep allegiance with their side of the divide. So what do we do about it? How do we change those rules of the game to free up our members of Congress and make politics a win-win industry? What we have to do is we have to change the rules. So the natural question is, which rules, right? Which ones? And what I'm going to purport to you all today is that it's not the rules that we often think about. It's not gerrymandering, it's not the Electoral College, it's not the fact that we don't have term limits, and it's not money in politics. Because by looking at our system through a competition lens, the politics industry theory identifies two rules that are both our biggest obstacles and also our biggest opportunities that have really been hiding in plain sight. So these two rules go back to the major structural problems of our voting system and the design of our electoral system itself. The first rule is party primaries. And for most people, I have to go through this and explain it to them. With the League, you all are very familiar with this problem, I believe, of party primaries, which is to say that in most of our elections these days, the election's decided in the primary. And again, as you all know, it's only about 20, maybe 20% in a good election year of voters that turn out for party primaries. So candidates in these primaries are generally pulled further to the right or further to the left than voters as a whole really want. So that's a problem, because that means in about 80%, or in our last election, 86% of our races for Congress, the winner was decided in that low turnout party primary by a very select few voters. But what I would argue, particularly from my background as a policy person, is that this influence, this unrepresentativeness of elections, also extends its influence into governing itself. So party primaries are really the single greatest structural contributor to why we have gridlock and, frankly, no results in Washington, D.C. So to illustrate that, I think the easiest way to talk about it is to play a thought experiment with me. So imagine you are a federal politician. You've been elected as a member of Congress for your part of Wisconsin. And it's not just what you have to say to get elected. It's that once you're in office and you're presented with an opportunity to consider a piece of landmark legislation, imagine a bipartisan, consensus-oriented, actual solution, effective solution to one of our nation's biggest problems. Pick whatever issue you care about. Is it fiscal policy? Is it immigration? Is it healthcare? Is it infrastructure? Is it education? You choose. You might think to yourself, all right, I'm looking at this piece of policy as an elected representative. What do I need to consider to decide whether or not I'm going to vote for this piece of legislation? You might want to consider if it's a good idea. Is it even the right policy for the country? Or is it the right policy for your constituents? Is it what the majority of your constituents would want you to vote for? But unfortunately, those questions may seem important, but the operative question for representatives today, because of our electoral system, is considering, if I vote for this piece of consensus-oriented legislation, will I make it back through my party primary? And if the answer to that question is no, which it virtually always is on the big issues that face our country, then all of those really good questions about whether or not it's good policy are fundamentally irrelevant, because the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Because if you vote yes, you're going to have a primary challenger. And you're probably doing a lot. We hear this all the time, right? I'm doing all these good things for my district, and it's really important that I stay in Congress and do my job well. So I can't take that difficult vote because I'll get primaried. So party primaries create this bizarre problem where no problem-solving politician can do what so many of them actually want to do in governing. So we don't get results, right? And we don't get results because there's no accountability for not getting results. There's no accountability because we, as customers in this industry of politics, we as voters, only have two choices. If you imagine any other industry that's as big and thriving and unfortunately in some ways money-making as politics is an industry, with the same degree of customer dissatisfaction and only two players, some entrepreneur would think it's a fabulous business opportunity because they'd come in as a new competitor and they'd respond to what we all want. But that doesn't happen in politics because there are these barriers to entry that are astronomically high. And the single greatest structural barrier to entry into this system, into this competitive market of politics, is how we vote, specifically this rule number 2, plurality voting. And again, it's not something we think about very often because it's kind of always how it's been in our country. Because when our country was young, there weren't a lot of examples of enduring and successful democracies. We were making it up. So our founding fathers copied the electoral system that was in existence at the time, British countryside elections. And in those elections, they declared the winner of an election to be the candidate with the most votes, even if that candidate didn't receive a majority of votes. So they could win by only gaining a plurality. Seems fair enough, but when you think about it, plurality voting means that in any race where there are more than 2 competitors, the winner can win with less than a majority of support. So for example, even in a 3-way race, a candidate could win with 34% of the vote, meaning that 66% of the voters preferred someone else. So again, plurality voting does not really seem fair or representative, but I would argue that the most important consequence, negative effect of plurality voting is that it eliminates this threat of substantive new competition, because plurality voting creates this spoiler or wasted vote effect. And again, this is something that you all, I'm sure, are very familiar with. It's that sometimes we don't vote for the candidate that we really want because we're afraid that it'll either waste our vote, or even worse yet, our vote will help elect the candidate that we like the least. So again, that's a problem, but far more often, this theory of spoiler or wasted vote problem just keeps people off the ballot in the first place. So rather than run and being a spoiler candidate or a wasted vote, potentially qualified candidates don't even get in the race. So it doesn't matter if you particularly like independent or third-party candidates or even inter-party competition, or think maybe that we have great candidates already. I think we can all agree and understand that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system where we are regularly told that having more passionate, talented competitors for us to choose from is somehow bad for us. Politics is really one of the only industries where we are regularly told that less competition is somehow better for us as the customer. And that shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be. So the electoral innovation that we're proposing for Wisconsin that was created by these Wisconsinites themselves is this innovation called Final 5 voting that solves both of these structural problems. It's 2 changes to how we vote, one in the primary and one in the general election. So first, let's address that party primary system problem. So let's get rid of we can change to a single ballot top 5 primary. So here's how that works. Imagine you're now looking at your ballot and you can choose. All candidates are on one ballot, no matter what their party affiliation is, and it would include third party and independent candidates on that primary ballot. So every candidate is on your ballot and you don't have to choose anymore. Are you going to vote in the Republican column or the Democratic column? You pick your favorite candidate regardless of their party affiliation, and the top 5 finishers advance to the general election. So the top 5 primary eliminates that narrowing problem of the party primary and allows legislators significantly more leeway when they're legislating to act in the public interest because they're not scared of that threat of the partisan primary anymore. So we have to take care of that second problem, right? So we've taken care of the primary problem. In this particular example, we'll say I vote for the Packers. And now we've got 5 candidates in a general election. So we have to somehow manage that competition. After that, general election competition where we've got real choices, We go in as voters and we use this system called instant runoff voting. What that means is we use a ranked choice ballot to vote. So in this particular example, I can vote for the Packers again, right? They were my favorite in the primary. They'll be my favorite in the general election, and I can stop there and my vote counts just like my vote counts today. But I can also tell you, if I want to, that I like the Bucks. The Brewers are okay. I don't really like the forward, and I definitely don't like the Admirals. I can rank as many or as few choices as I want on my ballot. And when the polls close, we tabulate all those first place votes. And if someone gets a true majority, if someone gets over 50% of the vote, the election is over and that candidate wins. But if the leader falls short of 50%, we enable this round of counting of instant runoff voting, where the last place candidate is automatically eliminated. And if I voted for that candidate who's now out of the race, my votes would transfer to my next choice. You tabulate again, and then and if someone gets over 50%, that person wins. That process of elimination and reallocation, runoffs essentially, happens until someone gets a majority of the vote, gets over 50%. What that means is that we are now always electing candidates who have the broadest appeal to the most voters. So that's meaningfully important. But it's also really important because it means that now there's no longer this great barrier to entry for new competition, because the spoiler argument is irrelevant. You can vote for the candidate that you really want to vote for without worrying that it's going to elect the candidate that you like least. It gives our voters real choice and lets competition create some accountability for results in governing. So if you think back to our original Venn diagram that was not intersecting, you can imagine that now under this system of final five voting, where we've moved to a top five primary and we've used instant runoffs in the general election, there's a different set of incentives for politicians. Because now, if you think back to your thought experiment that you're a member of Congress and you're looking at that bipartisan piece of landmark legislation, solving one of our country's biggest challenges, you can vote for that. You can vote for that piece of legislation because under the old system, you probably would have been primaried. But under the new system, you can think, well, gosh, I'll definitely make it in a top five primary. I'll definitely advance to a general election. And then I can appeal to the broad segment of my electorate in a general election where I'll get enough first choice votes and maybe even second choice and third choice votes to pull together a coalition of support and craft a win. So this system, final five voting, really realigns incentives around governing. If we implement them both at the same time, we get this ability to create results in Washington, D.C., because we've got some real accountability for doing so. There will be new competition if our elected officials do not deliver. So before you all think that I'm super naive and I'm overpromising some sort of utopia for democracy, let me clarify that definitely not. That Winston Churchill's quote rings true when he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except when it's compared to all of the others. Because as we all know more than anyone, I believe, we know that democracy is messy and we know that democracy is hard. But right now we have messy and hard and zero results. With final five voting, we're still going to have messy and hard governing. That's not going to go away. But sometimes there might be a possibility to have some good results to show for that messy and hard governing. So one of the most exciting pieces of all of this is that final five voting is super powerful, but it's also achievable. So we have proof now. In 2017, Catherine Gale, our co-chair, published her early work on politics industry theory through Harvard Business School with her co-author, Michael Porter. And the report made it all the way up to Alaska, where someone named Scott Kendall read the report. And then he took action on it. He used it to design a ballot initiative that included these new rules of an open primary and an instant runoff general election. And this past November, in November of 2020, the initiative passed. So Alaska became the first state in the nation that chose this system of healthy competition in politics, and it certainly won't be the last. So here in Wisconsin, we have bipartisan legislation that's been introduced by State Senator Dale Koyenga, State Senator Jeff Smith, Representative Tony Kurtz, and Representative Danny Remer are our 4 co-authors in the Senate and the Assembly, who have introduced legislation for Final 5 voting for Wisconsin's federal elections. And it's gaining traction. As you can see on this slide, it's been endorsed by the La Crosse Tribune, by the Wisconsin State Journal editorial boards, and it's really gaining support in the Wisconsin State Legislature. It says something today in our currently very polarized politics that we have introduced bipartisan legislation for systems change like this. I think it really highlights that one of the most powerful things about Final 5 voting is that it changes incentives without necessarily changing who gets elected. So you can get bipartisan support for something that's truly bipartisan, both in design of the system, but also in impact. It allows for us to have some healthy competition, to have accountability, while not being a secret Trojan horse to change a red district blue or a blue district red. It's truly a systems change that just allows voters to have more power in our electoral system by giving voters real choice over who represents them. So let me end by just sharing our information and saying that I think, again, you all feel this, I'm sure, as acutely as I do. It's really devastating when we think about how little we've come to expect from politics. So many of our friends and neighbors have just come to think that this gridlock, this partisanship is somehow normal, that we might complain about it, but so many people have really just given up in believing that it's ever going to change. But that's really no way to run our shining city on a hill that's America, because it's up to us. We can choose differently. Our Constitution gives us the power, and I would argue the responsibility, to remake our politics when we need to. And boy, do we need to. So with the greatest urgency and without fatigue, we must aggressively reclaim
my meeting.
because these are our politics, right? These are not red politics or blue politics. It's our politics as voters. So with that, I will thank you so much for having me today and look forward to diving into conversation with you all.
All righty. Sara Eskrich, you've been clear and persuasive, but I can see in the chat that audience members have questions and concerns. So it's good that we've left a few minutes for a Q&A. I will relay the audience questions and comments as they appear in the chat. And Deborah Byers, would you mute yourself, please? Thank you. Everybody else, remember to keep yourself mute, except when it's your turn to talk. Right away, we have a question from Brooke, and you've covered this a bit already, but your thoughts on this proposed legislation, that's AB 244 and SB 250, relating to top 5 primaries and instant runoff voting for the offices of U.S. Senator and U.S. Representative in Congress. And more comments about those specific bills, Sara?
Yeah, thanks for asking about the bills. The bills are bills we've been working on for years now. So Democracy Found formed about 3 years ago, a group of civic leaders from across Wisconsin, from across different partisanship. I always like to tell the story that at our launch event, we had one of the largest progressive donors, right? Donors to Democratic causes on the stage, with the only person who hosted a fundraiser in his home in 2016 for then candidate Donald Trump, come together to say, we don't agree on anything, right? We don't agree on politicians or politics, but we can come together to agree that our system itself is not working. So I say that to say that paved the way from the very beginning to building a coalition of support that was truly cross-partisan, that included partisan Democrats, partisan Republicans, and everybody in between. So that when we started talking with the legislature, gosh, over a year ago now, about a year and a half ago, about this idea of Final Five voting, we were able to build support, bipartisan support, for what is now AB 244 and SB 250. So the legislation was introduced this session for the first time. It is a rather significant change to our electoral system. So I will be direct with you all in saying that we don't expect these bills to pass this session. We've introduced them because we know it's important to get the conversation moving and going amongst our legislators, to make sure that they know that there's an alternative out there. One of the most powerful things is that, again, we like to complain about politics and we like to talk about certain solutions depending on which side we're on. But to talk about a solution that's truly systemic and can be supported by both sides is something that's really powerful in our politics today, and allows for the conversation about alternatives to be one that's productive in our legislative environment right now. So that's the goal of AB 244 and SB 250 this session, is building support in the Wisconsin State Legislature. That's really my job as executive director of our C4 Democracy Found Action every day, to drive that support forward. And we do expect to make some progress with that legislation over the coming years and build on the bipartisan support that we have for the initial introduction.
Well, League of Women Voters folks are persistent. We don't give up. We're not complainers, we're doers. It took 70 years to get the vote, and we just keep on going, identifying positive changes and working resolutely for them. And we're also very practical, Sara. And our next question comes from Judy, who I suspect is either a county clerk or a poll worker. And she says, okay, Sara, technically, how would this work around the state of Wisconsin? So give us some specifics.
Great. I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the ability to dive into this as a regular poll volunteer myself at the election day polls. I know how important it is to make sure that something is going to work for voters and for our very decentralized election system. Again, just a quick story. When we started this work, again, back in 2018, I never would have thought that there would be the degree of understanding that there now is about how elections are administered. One of our biggest problems in talking to people about this was that they didn't believe that it could possibly be done, because they thought it must take a constitutional amendment to change the way that we vote. But now we all know, as you all have known for a long time, that elections are administered locally. And in our state, that's more true than in almost any other state across the country. So what we know about particularly this system of Final Five voting, is that these two components, the single ballot primary and the instant runoff general election. The single ballot primary is quite simple to administer. It's very similar to what we do in our municipal elections, right? Our already nonpartisan elections. So there's not a significant technological or implementation challenge when it comes to that piece of the reform. The second piece, the instant runoff voting, the ranked choice ballot processing, is a change from what we do right now. So let me speak to that particular step in elections administration. So all new machines, right, ballot tabulating machines, can process a ranked choice ballot, because ranked choice voting has been around for a long time, just not in our elections. So municipalities across the country, in over a dozen states now, are using ranked choice voting for their local elections. So the technology has adapted to be able to process that ranked choice ballot. Other countries have been using ranked choice ballots or variations of ranked choice voting for almost a century, Ireland, Australia. So it's not a new component, it's not a new system that can't be processed. It's a matter of making that implementation change something that our clerks have the tools and resources to do at the local level. So that's a key piece of our work, is to make sure that we're having conversations with our clerks, both at the county and at the municipal level, to make sure that they have resources available to do, honestly, what so many of them are trying to do right now anyway, which is upgrade their elections systems A lot of our elections, again, this is not going to be new to you all, but a lot of our election administration, the funds for that came out of the 2000 election and have not really gotten an influx of federal funds since that time. So there's, with all the conversation about elections and election administration, I'm cautiously optimistic that perhaps some of our funds that are coming down from the Recovery Act and so on and so forth will be used for updating our election systems at the local level. Now, at the same time, you can process a ranked choice ballot via hand count. The city of Minneapolis has been hand counting their ranked choice ballots at the local level for a long time. Yes, it takes longer, but there's a transparency about that as well. When you look at Ireland, we were talking to someone recently, was on a webinar sharing the Irish experience with this process. And rather than having this expectation that results are going to come out night of, there's really almost a week of tabulation, and it could make for very nerdy political TV for those of us who would want to follow that sort of thing, you know, where people are at in these rounds of runoffs, and continuing to make sure that there's a transparency to this process that drives trust amongst voters, which, as we know, is incredibly important. The other thing that I would say about implementation and what we've learned from these experiments in other states, which is of benefit to us, is that voters do very well with ranked choice ballots. In New York City, while they had some real fumbles with the way in which they administered their election, that really had nothing to do with the ranked choice system, it had more to do with their election administration in general, 95% of voters, when asked, were not confused by the ranked choice ballot. They said 95% of voters said, yep, made sense. I was totally fine with it. In other areas that have implemented this system, like the state of Maine, we see very high voter satisfaction, and in fact, growth of use of ranked choice ballots over time. So it's something that for voters is actually quite empowering, because it gives you the ability to show your full preference on your ballot, and that's something that's attractive to voters. We say all the time, we rank things in our life every day without thinking about it in that way, perhaps, but you're probably doing it tonight. Am I going to go out to dinner? Am I going to make something? Am I going to make pasta? Am I going to make pizza? Right? Ranking in your head what your choices are, and then coming to some sort of consensus, perhaps with other members of your household, to find something that's commonly acceptable to everybody. We do that in our life, and the fact that we don't have any real choices in our electoral system is honestly a frustration for voters that this system helps to alleviate. So I hope I've addressed to some degree the technological challenges around implementation and how we overcome them, but also that one of the key things with this is to make sure that voters have an understanding of how the system works, and making sure that that education is done in conjunction with implementation, so that they do get to take full advantage of the system. And we are committed to doing educational outreach presentations as we're advocating for this change, but also once the change is passed, as it's being implemented, to make sure there's time for implementation and that voters get the resources that they need. And I expect there might be partners in some of you all in your local leagues for some of that education and outreach, should we get to that point, and have appreciated the opportunities to do pre-education on this system already.
Okay, well, your answer to Judy actually covered Joseph's question about what happened recently in New York. And we're not even going to get to California yet. I'm saving that for Brooke's next question. But on the notion of learning from the laboratories of democracy, local laboratories, and getting around glitches and unintended consequences and complications. Susan says, with ranked choice voting, you can still end up with a winner who did not get a majority of first place votes, as in the New York City mayoral primary. Also in that election, the tabulation of votes was complicated and took almost 2 weeks, adding to reasons for losers to allege fraud. Want to say something to that?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So let's dive into New York City, because it's a great question. It really highlights that there are, I think someone mentioned this in the chat, there are various ways to use a ranked choice ballot. So our system is not akin to, it's not the same as ranked choice voting alone, because it is important, we believe, the Wisconsin solution that we've come up with, to pair this change of primary reform with using that ranked choice ballot in the general election. So New York City did not do that. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I'll make a bit of an editorial comment here. In New York City, they have partisan municipal elections. So they have a partisan primary for mayor. They did not open up that partisan primary. They simply used ranked choice voting within their party primaries. So you don't get to those same competitive focused results, right? We haven't even had the general election in New York City yet, and we already know who's going to be mayor. So they didn't really change the, frankly, enfranchisement of independent or Republican voters in New York City with the way that they implemented ranked choice voting. So I would argue that that in and of itself is a problem with how they implemented. The other challenge with the way in which they implemented is that their election administration is different than ours. They allow for collection of absentee ballots after the election day deadline. So that, as you all know, is different than how we do things in Wisconsin. So result tabulation did take a long time to answer that question, but it was not the fault of the electoral system. It was the fact that they were still collecting ballots and tabulating results after election day. So when you can imagine in this particular system, it's really, and in any system, right? It's really important to make sure that you have all results in before you start tabulating results, or make that very clear to the electorate, which is a challenging thing to do. So in this particular example, you saw the results change over that 2-week period of tabulation because votes were still coming in and they were still processing. So again, that would have happened in a plurality voting system, just as it happened in a ranked choice voting system. To the question about, what does a majority winner mean? It's a very good one, which is to say there is something different about an electoral system where first and sometimes second or even third choice votes count. What I would argue is that it's actually a benefit to those of us who are voters and who want to have, again, that degree of healthy competition in our electoral system. I think back to when I served on the city council here in Madison, where I live. And I remember running for that election and knocking on doors, even if someone had my opponent's yard sign in their yard, because I knew that that's right. Yard signs don't vote. That's we say that in campaigns all the time, but also there's something to say for building a rapport with voters, even if they might not vote for you, to still have respect, to have a conversation. And perhaps I learned more times than I thought I was going to that maybe one person in that household was already sold on one candidate, but the other person in that household was very open for grabs. That's not usual in campaigning, right? We are so, in this current polarized system, used to just segmenting our electorate and talking and trying to turn out those who already agree with us. So ranked choice voting changes that campaign dynamic because all of a sudden you want second choice votes. So you might say, I'm a Dorothy voter, true and true. And Sarah, I'm also running in that election. I'm still going to talk to those Dorothy voters because I want their second choice. So I'm not going to just alienate and malign and throw mud at Dorothy as my opponent. I might differentiate myself from a policy perspective from her, but the tenor of my campaign, if I'm strategic, is likely to be different under ranked choice voting and allows for that coalition of support to happen. So I'm always a little bit cautious about saying majority support when it comes to tabulation, because you all are attuned enough to know that sometimes that person might win with first and second choice votes, but it does show that there's broadest support for the candidate that wins amongst the entirety of the electorate, which I believe is very powerful for both those campaign dynamics that are so awful in our current political system, but even more importantly, again, right, the governing dynamics, which is to say now I matter, even if I'm a voter who didn't rank whoever wins first. that candidate has every desire in governing to care about their general electorate, which is different than right now when they only care about their primary electorate, but also the majority of their general electorate. They want to get the majority of their voters to think that they are doing a good job, which is incredibly powerful from an incentives perspective.
Okay, we'll go on to
What's next,
one more
Dorothy?
question. I think we've pretty well covered the things in the chat. I want to cover one more briefly, and then I want to exert the moderator's prerogative of asking the final question, Sarah. And so now we're going to get to the California question from Brooke. Thinking back to the incredible list of candidates on the recent ballot in California to recall Governor Newsom, what requirements should we have for people getting on the primary ballot in the first place? Choosing from 10 candidates might make sense. I can't imagine most voters could sensibly rank a list of 100 candidates. Would
Yes.
what do you do about that?
I appreciate, Brooke, you asking the question because it allows me to make sure that I'm very clear on this part of our change. So in the primary reform piece, we are not asking voters to rank. We are asking voters to pick one. So just like in our current system, candidates get on the ballot by collecting signatures. We don't change it. The legislation that we're advocating for doesn't change that. Candidates still need to collect their signatures by the deadline, submit them, validate them, show that they've got enough support to make it onto that primary ballot. But the difference is now you can see you might have multiple Republican candidates, multiple Democratic candidates, an independent candidate, third-party candidates, all on that primary ballot, and you pick one. So the primary essentially is a narrowing mechanism so that when we get to the general election, there are only 5 candidates, which alleviates against that California problem that Brooke is rightly pointing to, which is that voters cannot, right? We as human beings can only hold so much in our brains. Data science actually shows that there's an efficiency frontier between getting a degree of healthy competition in the electoral system, but not so much that it overwhelms voters' ability to process those candidates, to make sure that there's clear distinctions between those candidates, that those candidates, frankly, can get earned media and attention to bring their candidacy to the voters. So 5 is that sweet spot of making sure that there's healthy competition in that election, but not such an overwhelming amount of candidates on that ballot that voters can't meaningfully differentiate and rank those candidates according to their preference. So again, final 5 voting is a change to the primary, which is you pick your favorite candidate and the top 5 advance. And then in the general election, you have the option, if you so choose, to rank your candidates, and we go through a series of instant runoffs to make sure that the candidate has the broadest support. Those 2 changes together are the most powerful way for us to realign these incentives for governing and results in our politics. And it's important to think about them working together to be most powerful for voters.
All right, thank you, Sarah. The questions keep pouring into the chat. I just love League members. You can depend on them for a lot of tough questions and skepticism. All right. And we won't be able to get to all of these, but I want to kind of capture a combination of those in a final question. Should this reform be understood as separate from other proposed election processes and reforms like the other ones we're going to discuss during this issues briefing? And will this method on its own achieve the goal of more competitive races and more broadly responsive elected officials? Or are other reforms absolutely required concomitantly? Final question, Sarah.
I appreciate the question, Dorothy. It's a very important one. And I would answer it by saying, going back to what I said about there being no silver bullet, right? There's no perfect system. There's no perfect reform that's going to solve everything for our democracy. And yet, final 5 voting is a really powerful reform that can stand alone when it comes to creating healthy competition in elections. Because regardless of how the map is drawn or the amount of money in the politics, you have a degree of competition and accountability in that general election. So let me just emphasize that point in particular. Again, I think you all, that's going to resonate more than most audiences. The idea that we're shifting competition from the primary to the general election inherently makes elections more accountable and gives voters more power. So to your theme today of empowering voters, that particular piece of Final Five voting is what makes it so powerful, even if it's passed on its own. So we talk about Final Five voting as separate from all of these other potential changes, but there's nothing to say for the fact that you can't do many things to improve our democracy. Our democracy is something that is always, I believe Robert La Follette, Fighting Bob La Follette said it best, it's always in the making. It's up to us to make our democracy. And the fact that it has reached this point where it is so unrepresentative and unaccountable means perhaps we've been sitting on our heels a bit too long, means that it needs some innovation and change. And it's important that we work to do that in such a way that it is systemic, it is nonpartisan, it is going to benefit voters. And Final Five voting is a powerful, powerful way to make sure that we give that power to create accountability and competition in our system to voters. So
All right,
I hope that resonates. I think it probably does with many of you, but that is what is, for me, what is most exciting about this change is that it is something that is truly systemic and nonpartisan, frankly, in both the theory, but also in the impact. Critically important to move this legislation in Wisconsin right now.
Okay, for the questions that we didn't get to, Sarah, you'll have access to the chat, and folks will also have access. You put in your email so they can address them directly to you. So we've got that covered. Sarah, it sounds like open top five primary followed by ranked choice in the general elections can be very effective mechanism for ending up with government representatives who truly represent the will and best interest of the voters. Definitely, it's a potential means of voter empowerment. That's our theme today. Thank you for speaking with us and for carrying forward Democracy Found's proposal. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. Please do be in touch, anyone, if you'd like to have more conversation or a local conversation in your neck of the woods. I'm happy to come to you and talk more.
Is everyone back in the main room? All right. Well, then, this is Deborah Cron again. I'm the Executive Director for the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. And it is my great pleasure at this time to introduce Deborah Turner to all of you. Dr. Turner serves as the 20th President of the League of Women Voters of the United States and is the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the League of Women Voters Education Fund. Like many of us, Dr. Turner joined a local league, in her case, the Des Moines Metropolitan League, in 2010 and became its president in 2011. Dr. Turner was elected to the League's National Board of Directors in 2016, where she served on the Finance Committee, Governance Committee, and chaired the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Turner has been a champion for our organizational transformation, ensuring that we are relevant, sustainable, and accessible to all. Dr. Turner received her BS from Iowa State University, her MD from the University of Iowa. She practiced gynecological oncology for 35 years, enhancing university programs at the University of Nebraska, University of Iowa, and the Medical College of Wisconsin, teaching students and residents. She received her JD from Drake University in 2007. Dr. Turner currently lives in Nebraska, has 2 grown children. Please join me in welcoming our National Board President, Dr. Deborah Turner.
Thank you, Deborah. It's good to see you again. And good morning, everyone. It is absolutely delightful to be here with my fellow Midwesterners on this beautiful Saturday morning, at least here in Omaha. I'm excited with you today to chat with you. I'm sitting here in Omaha and thinking about how over the many years I've sat in and been engaged in virtual issues briefings and how critical and important they are. These issues briefings are critical to our role as advocates for all the issues that affect us and those we care about. And I'm so glad to see you guys being engaged today in such a really good meeting. So whether your concern is environmental protection or equal wages for women or access to affordable housing and healthcare, the opportunity to make your priorities known starts with one action, your vote. It's your power, it's your voice, and has never been under more threat than right now. I'm sure I'm not alone when I tell you that I've had some serious shaking my head and quite frankly, internal, sometimes external screaming moments over the last year. One of them was when a state passed legislation preventing people from giving others water in a voting line on a hot day. You could actually face jail time and a fine of $1,000. While we can't know how this will be enforced, the fact that state legislators put their time, energy, and state resources into something so clearly designed to suppress voters and suppress votes and set things back is a very, very dangerous precedent. And this is happening all over our country. That's just one example of what we're up against, folks. It's nasty and sometimes even petty. These tactics are designed to keep Americans from voting. It is therefore incumbent upon us as a nonpartisan organization that works to empower voters and defend democracy to fight back for voters. And what does our fight look like? Here's where we stand on voting rights today. Congress and the White House have still a lot of work to do. The House of Representatives passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in August, and it still awaits a vote in the Senate. This bill was written to ensure that people of color are not disenfranchised by reestablishing and restoring the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the past, as you may remember, the Voting Rights Act got 100% participation and agreement on both sides of the aisle. I have no doubt that this bill would have garnered strong bipartisan support even a few years ago, but not today. Today, we are in a different place, and it is a different climate in our country. A second piece of important legislation was passed earlier this year in the House, the For the People Act, and the Senate's version, the Freedom to Vote Act, failed to move forward on the Senate floor earlier this month. Passing the Freedom to Vote Act would cut the influence of dark money influence on our elections. It would curb partisan gerrymandering and make sure every person is represented fairly. It would expand access to the ballot for millions of Americans. These are ideas that all Americans stand for, and the people who represent them should know and understand and need to act accordingly. Then there is the Washington, D.C. Admission Act, known to most as D.C. Statehood. 700,000 Americans, many of them Black and brown, pay taxes, but have no representation in Congress. That's just wrong. The bill passed the House in April and again now awaits Senate passage. So for the last few months, League members have been protesting and getting arrested, yes, in front of the White House, demanding that President Biden use the pressure of his office to get these critical pieces of legislation passed. We're moving the needle, but the legislative clock is ticking. We're going to keep showing up with our partners at the White House until the president uses the full power of the presidency to bring lawmakers together and ensure the passage of federal voting rights legislation for the people of America. The fact that these important pieces of legislation are not sailing easily through Congress, coupled with the clear need for continued protest, signals to me that the League's role, both at the national level and the local level, is more important than ever. We are going to be challenged in some new ways as well as old ways. We must ensure our democracy is protected and works for all of us, including the women who just became an American citizen last week and can't wait to cast her first vote, or the woman of color who has for years tried to register to vote and been denied, but is determined to have her voice heard this year, or for the woman whose district was just redrawn changing her local representation and threatening the resources she and her family need. Or the woman who works 3 jobs and needs access to an absentee ballot to participate. It's our job to work for them. It is our job to fight for them. When we fight for and work for women in America, we fight for and work for America because women power America's democracy. I hope by now that you have all heard of the League's Women Power Democracy programming focus. Today, I want to tell you a little bit more about what it is and why it's important. I'll start with the Democracy Truth Project. This is all about battling misinformation and disinformation, which is extremely dangerous to our democracy. Falsehoods can, falsehoods can mislead Americans about where and when they can cast a ballot, indirectly suppressing their votes. Lies, yes, call them what they are, yes, lies about how elections are run can weaken the public's essential trust in our democracy, and we won't stand for it. We are working with our trusted partners, including leading scholars, who are studying the trends of mis and disinformation to combat the influx of lies. Americans deserve trusted and accurate information about their candidates and about the election processes. We're working to expand voter registration also, especially those voices who are often shut out of important conversations, such as Americans with limited incomes, communities of color, youth, women, and new citizens. We call this our Expand the Franchise initiative. This is where Vote 411 will play an important role. Its sole purpose is to increase voter participation and educate voters so they can make a confident and informed choice on election day. And this is not just for presidential elections, but local ones too. Those matters just as much. And as we look to next year's midterm elections, I want people to know that information about those races is available on vote411.org. I believe that vote411.org should be a common household word in every house in America. You will see us vigorously defending rights across the country also, and we will never back down from that fight. We call this the third pillar of our Women Defending Democracy. We call this our Democracy Defense Fund. Following the 2020 election, hundreds of anti-voter bills that disproportionately target voters of color, women voters, and youth voters have been introduced in state legislatures across the country. The League is speaking out and fighting back, and we need our local leagues to do the same. It starts with educating the public about anti-voter bills in your states so that these discriminatory bills do not become law. For those that do, we will participate as necessary in litigation to mitigate their effect. And finally, we're going to ensure fair, transparent, and equitable representation through the People-Powered Fair Maps project. This is our pillar designed to stop gerrymandering from creating unfair advantages for any political party. Gerrymandering is, to put it simply, geographic manipulation to dilute the will of the people. It divides the population's power by splitting their votes into separate electoral districts. We want to ensure fair political maps in all 50 states and DC. So how do we get there? First, redistricting needs to be a transparent process. Second, we need Americans to pay attention when these maps are drawn or redrawn and call out instances where new boundaries will divide their communities of interest. Third, we need to share what we know with our friends and families and encourage them to become advocates themselves. We have to give people the power to voice their opinions, to voice their concerns, and know that their voice and their vote will count. We have that duty as members of the League of Women Voters. Too much is flying under the radar these days. Powering democracy requires our full attention. Sometimes it takes standing up to a family member or friend and saying, actually, that's not accurate. It means getting involved, sometimes becoming uncomfortable, but the stakes are too high to do otherwise. Your engagement with this event today reinforces that the passion and commitment in Wisconsin is strong. But I'd like to ask you to do a little bit more. Help people learn about vote411.org website and all the amazing resources they can find there. Information is powerful. Recruit friends to be poll workers with you in your next election. This is a vital role in ensuring democracy works in our elections. Share the League's blog posts and social media messages with your networks, with your friends, with your family. We know our information is reliable and accurate. Encourage acquaintances to register to vote if they aren't already. Often a personal ask is the most effective way to get out the vote. How many times have we had people say, when you ask, did you vote? They go, well, nobody asked me. Well, we're going to do the asking. Research the political district maps being drawn where you live. If something seems out of line, make a public comment saying so. And tell your friends and family who live in other parts of the country to do the same. And so important. Where you hear a falsehood about voting, call it out. If you see voter suppression taking place, call it out. Shine a light on the attacks against our democracy. That's the only way we'll ensure it lives on. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. We stand on a precipice in our country, and we can either fly or we can fall. The League has boundless potential to take flight, to protect and shape our democracy's future and build the power of women. There is power in our name and power in our numbers. We can and should shamelessly leverage it every chance we get. Democracy is not a spectator sport. To win, we must be in the game. And remember, there are some simple things that are truths. One, voting is not a partisan issue. It is an American issue. Two, that every vote does count. And three, that we, as members of this organization, have the power to move the dial if we have the will. So thank you again to the Wisconsin League for all that you do and for having me here today. These are critical times, and I know unequivocally that you guys are doing critical work, and we are so proud of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. We so appreciate you being here with us this morning for motivation, for inspiration. I want to open it up to anyone who might have a question. You can either raise your hand or type it into the chat of Dr. Turner. We have a few minutes, and I'll start off. We are in this fight up to our eyeballs, obviously, but we have many partners in this space with us. And I'd just like you to share some of your thoughts about how important our partners and allies are in this fight for our democracy.
You know, Deborah, and to everybody listening and engaged today, that partners are critical. Let's be honest. There are a lot of us, and the League is powerful and has a voice, but we cannot do it alone. And one of the most important things that any league can do at the local level or the state level is to start looking around and developing partnerships with other groups that are like-minded. For example, just as we look back at the days we're spending now, in Lafayette Square or Park, pushing the White House to do the work that they need to do, we have partners. We've partnered with several organizations that are critical. Without them, we could not do it. And as they see us out there, more people are willing to join us. The trick is learning how to reach out to partners. And there are many ways to do it, as you know, and you probably have talked about it. But first of all, knowing someone in another organization that you think might be helpful or might be a partner to us, reach out to them personally and say, this is what the League does, and we really would like to partner with you. That, I tell you, the personal touch is probably the most critical thing. The second thing is, for the last year, we've talked a lot about partisanship and nonpartisanship. And we know we're kind of at this crossroads where we're struggling with that as a League. And one of the things that I had a really good talk about this with Virginia yesterday. And we were talking about the fact that we can partner with organizations that may, in some part of their work, have a partisan issue. For example, an organization that may or may not advocate for a given candidate in their C4 work. Well, if we're doing C3 work with them and we're not engaged in that side, it is not unreasonable for us to do things around with them, for example, like around voting rights or that. So as we start to look at who we can be in partnership with, we need to expand our thoughts of who that may be. And that's a struggle for us. It makes us a little squirmy as leaguers, because our rules have been so strict, and we still believe in nonpartisanship and we still believe in the DEI piece, but we have to expand our partnerships if we're going to be successful, unequivocally.
Thank you. We have a question from Joy, who is indicating that, the League of Women Voters members and many others are working to ban gerrymandering and stop sham audits and fight voter suppression in our state. But our GOP-controlled legislature is plowing forward and voting against the public will. While the Democratic governor, Governor Evers in our case, will veto these initiatives, the conservative Supreme Court is expected to uphold the gerrymandered maps anyway. Any advice? What can we do, Dr. Turner?
Well, one of the first things to do there is that obviously many of these comes down to the point of first educating the public about what's going on so they can raise their voices and advocate for and organize around telling your legislature and your other citizens of Wisconsin what's going on, honestly, get rid of the disinformation. But the other piece is partnering with our league at the national level, because we have some really, really good staff members, excellent staff members that deal with both litigation and advocacy, who not only can help you design programs that might be able to, for example, if there's going to be litigation, design a litigation pattern that might be different than you're thinking about, but they also have partners across the country that you may not be aware of, that if a given state may not realize that they could partner with or join up with would help them move the dial in Wisconsin. So using that resource and the resources of our national folks who have approaches across the whole country is also helpful. And once again, it comes down to, it still comes down to that basic issue that our elected representatives are the people that somebody voted for, right? Everybody who's elected, somebody voted for. So we also have to look at the fact that our most powerful tool right now is going to be getting the vote out, not just getting people registered, but getting the vote out, because the people who don't vote are the people who think their voice isn't going to count. And they many times are the people who believe in the things that we believe in. And the only way they're going to have any impact is to make sure that we get them to the polls and they vote in whatever way they can. I know it's not going to be something we can overturn overnight, but those are the things that are going to eventually make a difference.
Thank you. Ann Batista has asked a question in the chat having to do with media, censorship, the role of large tech in our messaging. And if you could open up your microphone, I'd like you to ask your question directly of Dr. Turner.
Hi, Dr. Turner. My concern, you mentioned that you're working with partners to prevent misinformation from being disseminated. And I've been following this in terms of the tech giants being brought before Congress. And it appears at this point that an accommodation is being made that if the tech giants suppress the voices of opposition and amplify the voices that not just voting misinformation, but that they amplify the voices of particular parties. And we've seen this already. 2 years ago, the World Socialist website, their traffic decreased by 70% because Facebook outsources to the Atlantic Council much of their fact checking and so on. And the algorithms are adjusted. This is a huge threat to democracy because so many people get their information via tech giants. And I don't want to see the League of Women Voters becoming an advocate for censorship because ultimately dissidents will be censored. Dissidents provide often information that our government, the powerful, want to be kept secret. And when our institutions that are beloved, like the League of Women Voters, come on the side of censorship, even with good motives, my concern is that ultimately all of our freedoms, all our democracy itself, depends upon freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So that's my concern.
Thank you for that question. And that is one of the major concerns that we all have too. And we do talk about at the national level also, and the question becomes how the concept of freedom of speech is used nowadays, and what freedom of speech really means. And we really don't talk about that. We just assume that anything anybody says should be freedom of speech. So first of all, we have to define of what we think of freedom of speech. Are there types of speech that should be, if we want to use the word like censored or discouraged, for example, as opposed to censored? Censored is censored is one of those hot topic buttons that, what do we mean by censored? Does that mean that somebody has the ability just to remove anything that somebody doesn't like from a source, like say Facebook, for example? Or does it mean that you have rules and regulations that help determine what is safe and what is honest? Our problem is that with freedom of speech is that I think we have to get down to the real nitty gritty. There's freedom to lie. So do we want freedom to lie? Well, if we want freedom to lie, then let's say that. If we want freedom to, for your kids to be bullied on Facebook, well, then let's say that's what you want. If you want freedom, if you want some guardrails around that, I think you can build guardrails. And the League believes you can build guardrails without total censorship. And that's where we stand in that lane, that there have to be some guardrails, but we're not talking about total censorship. And I think as a society has to figure out what they want and what they need and what they're comfortable with for guardrails. That's what all the laws are about. Our laws are simply guardrails against something, and I think that we need to look at that too when it comes to things like media and disinformation and misinformation, that we need to say, what do we need for guardrails that makes our society safe so everybody has the opportunity to be free to do what they want to do.
The difficulty comes in legal definitions, and we already have we have laws on the book to protect certain kind of speech and to outlaw particular kinds of speech. But when the legal definitions become very fuzzy, then unfortunately, I'm afraid that they can be used to censor dissidents. And all the things that you've said, of course, make absolute sense until you look at legally, how do you do that? And how do you, in fact, prevent the censorship of dissidents? And if you want to talk about misinformation, there's plenty of misinformation to go around from all of our media sources who have become partisan and using PR strategy to deliver news. That's a really dangerous situation. And so I'm just saying, we don't want to support
We
this.
so value your opinion. I want to take one last question. We have about a minute left, and Jane Benson has had her hand up. If you want to take yourself off of mute.
What I wanted to ask is the vote 411. We haven't embraced it very well because we can't get Republican candidates to take a position for vote 411. And we're having trouble getting Republicans to commit to forums, which the League does so well. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, just to let you know that tends to be a problem across the country in many places. And one thing that we've done, or we did somewhat in one of my local leagues in the past, was that in order to get, even though the candidates maybe do not, we always put all the candidates in there regardless, whether they answer the questions or not, which is key. So everybody knows at least, because one of the big things about Vote for 1-1 is great. The candidate information is valuable. There's no question about it. But the basic information about who your candidates are and where you're going to vote and what your ballot looks like is as critical to people as even what the candidates have to say. So just having the candidates there so they know who's on the ticket is really critical, okay? The other thing is that this is once again one of those things where it may take some hard work to maybe develop a relationship with a candidate or a candidate staff or a candidate's person to say, we just, to give them a little bit more information. And it's time for us to really show or tell candidates from the other who are refusing to participate, which as we know, a lot of times is from the Republican Party, that the Vote for 1-1 is simply a tool for people getting information. And if they know that the only way a lot of people are going to get the information that they feel or believe in is by putting it there, because if they don't have any information there, then that person isn't going to see anything about them. And then therefore that person's more, if you don't see something, you're going to be more likely not to vote for that person. So I think we need to message different about what Vote for 1-1 really is. And I think that's one of the critical things that I've been struggling with, how we get the public and candidates to understand that it's simply a tool just like any other voter guide, but it's just more extensive. I wish there was a silver bullet or a quick answer to that. But like I said, developing the relationships and really messaging to all candidates what it's about. Maybe there's just the time to make a big splash where you reach out to every single candidate and say, this is what Vote for 1-1 is, this is what it does, this is the information, and then let them look at it, as opposed to them getting their misinformation about Vote for 1-1. So.
Thank you. Dr. Turner, thank you so much for your time this morning, for your leadership. We will take your words and keep marching forward. With that, I will turn it back to Dorothy so she can close our program.
Thank you for having me.
I gotta add my thanks to you, Dr. Turner. You are so articulate and well-informed. You are spot on those issues and had substantive things to say, action steps for us to take, and specific suggestions. And I took particularly the suggestion, that last one about step out personally to develop a relationship with folks on the other side and the party who's choosing not to put their information in Vote for 1-1. So we will take that to heart, as well as your other remarks. Thank you very much. This has been an intense and informative Issues Briefing 2021. Thanks to all who participated and to the staff and volunteers who made it possible. I wish we could be together for the luncheon conversations we so enjoy as part of in-person league gatherings. We'll do that once again for sure. Meanwhile, our social distancing is a sign that we care about one another's health and safety. Finally, in spite of our physical separation, I hope this briefing has served to reunite us in our collective purpose. Let's all heed the call to actions that speak even louder than the good words we've heard today. So bye-bye, everybody, and thanks so much.